My uncle never once told me he had money. Not directly, anyway. I found out by accident, actually. I was maybe 24, helping him move some boxes, and I saw a brokerage statement sitting on his desk. The number on it didn't match anything about how he lived. Same car for 11 years, same modest house, in the same neighborhood since before I was born. He clipped coupons, genuinely, not as a bit, actual coupons, in an actual folder. I asked him about it later, half joking, and he said something I've thought about constantly since. He said, "The people who talk about money the loudest are usually still figuring it out. The ones who've actually figured it out stopped needing anyone to know." That stuck with me, and over the years, working on this channel, talking to people, reading research on this exact question, I've noticed the same pattern shows up again and again. There are specific habits that quietly separate people who build real, lasting wealth from people who just look like they have money. And almost none of these habits are the ones that get talked about in typical finance content. So today, I want to walk you through 7 of them. The quiet ones, the ones that don't make for exciting headlines, but that show up consistently in people who've actually built something real. Stay with me through all 7, because a few of these might surprise you, and one of them, specifically the last one, tends to be the one people resist the most, even though it might matter the most. Let's start with the one that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it's probably the most consistently present habit across people who quietly build wealth over decades. They're comfortable with financial boredom, genuinely, deeply comfortable with it. Most financial content is built around excitement, the hot stock, the clever strategy, the thing nobody else is doing yet. But the people who actually accumulate significant wealth over time tend to do something that looks, from the outside, almost aggressively unremarkable. Same contribution, same account, same allocation, year after year, with very little drama. My uncle's portfolio, from what I eventually saw, hadn't changed its core strategy in probably 15 years. There's a reason this matters more than it sounds like it should. Every time someone chases something more exciting, a new investment trend, a strategy shift, a reaction to whatever's dominating financial news that month, there's a real cost, not just in potential losses, but in the compounding time that gets disrupted by starting over, moving money around, second-guessing an approach that was probably working fine. Boredom, in this specific context, isn't a lack of sophistication. It's often the entire strategy, disguised as nothing happening. I remember asking him once, during a period when a specific stock was all over the news, whether he'd bought in. He hadn't even looked at it. Not because he'd researched it and decided against it. He genuinely hadn't spent any mental energy on it at all. His attention was, in his words, already spoken for by the plan he'd built years earlier. That specific kind of disinterest, the ability to let exciting financial noise pass by without feeling compelled to react to it, tends to be one of the clearest markers separating people who quietly compound wealth over decades from people who technically know more about investing, but end up with less to show for it, simply because their strategy kept shifting toward whatever felt most urgent that particular month. Here's a distinction that surprised me when I first noticed it. The people who quietly build wealth usually know their numbers extremely well. Their net worth, their spending patterns, their investment allocation, but they check them infrequently, almost casually. It's a specific kind of relationship with the numbers, not avoidance and not obsession. Somewhere in between. They might genuinely know their approximate net worth within a few $1,000s without having checked it in 3 months, because the underlying systems are stable enough that checking constantly wouldn't actually change anything meaningful. This is different from what a lot of people do, which tends to fall into one of 2 extremes. Either avoiding the numbers entirely because looking feels stressful, or checking obsessively, which research on investor behavior consistently links to worse decision-making, specifically because frequent checking increases the emotional reactivity to normal, short-term fluctuations that don't actually matter for a long-term outcome. Knowing your numbers cold, without needing to check them constantly, tends to reflect genuine confidence in the underlying system rather than anxiety about the current moment. Habit 3. They let some purchases be genuinely extravagant. This one tends to surprise people because it goes against the never spend on anything stereotype. People who quietly build wealth over long periods often spend, without guilt, on a small number of specific things they genuinely value, while remaining almost aggressively frugal on everything else. My uncle, for instance, spent what I'd consider a genuinely large amount on very specific hobby equipment, something he'd been into since he was young, but he'd drive 45 minutes out of his way to save on groceries. This isn't inconsistency, it's actually a specific, deliberate strategy that behavioral economists sometimes describe as value-based spending, identifying the small number of categories that genuinely matter to your quality of life, spending freely and without guilt in those specific areas, while cutting hard everywhere else. The mistake most people make isn't spending too much. It's spending moderately across everything with no clear priority, which means nothing gets the resources to feel genuinely satisfying, while nothing gets cut hard enough to create real savings either. What made this work for him specifically, I think, was how clearly he'd separated the two categories in his own mind. There was no guilt attached to the hobby spending. None of the second guessing that a lot of people experience when they buy something they genuinely want. And there was no resentment attached to the frugality either. Driving out of his way for groceries wasn't a sacrifice he felt bitter about, because it was funding something he'd already decided actually mattered to him. That clarity, knowing exactly which categories deserve generosity and which deserve discipline, tends to be the part people skip when they try to copy this habit. They focus on the frugal side without doing the harder work of honestly identifying what deserves the extravagance in the first place. Habit 4. They don't wait for a financially ready feeling. This is a subtle one, but it shows up consistently. A lot of people delay starting to invest or delay increasing their savings rate, waiting for some internal signal that they're finally ready. Enough emergency fund, enough understanding of the market, enough stability that it feels comfortable to begin. People who quietly build wealth tend to start before that feeling arrives, often specifically because they've noticed the feeling doesn't reliably show up on its own. I think about this like learning to swim. You don't wait to feel completely confident in the water before getting in. The confidence tends to arrive after some experience, not before it. Financially, this looks like starting with an uncomfortably small amount rather than waiting for a comfortable large one, automating a modest contribution now instead of planning a more serious one for some future point when things feel more settled. The specific insight here is that the ready feeling is often a consequence of having started, not a prerequisite for it. Habit 5. They actively avoid financial conversations with certain people. This one's a little uncomfortable to talk about, but it's real and it's consistent. People who quietly build wealth tend to be deliberately selective about who they discuss money with, specifically avoiding conversations that consistently leave them feeling either envious or superior. Both directions, interestingly, tend to distort decision-making. Comparing upward creates pressure towards spending or risk that doesn't fit your actual situation, and comparing downward can quietly encourage complacency, a feeling that you're already doing fine relative to others, even when your own numbers suggest otherwise. My uncle, notably, almost never talked about money with extended family, specifically because he'd noticed those conversations tended to leave him either anxious or smug, neither of which improved his actual decisions afterward. He talked about money in any real depth with maybe 2 people in his entire life, people whose judgment he trusted and whose situations were different enough from his own that comparison wasn't really the point of the conversation. There's a broader pattern here worth naming because it shows up constantly in how people talk about money on social media specifically. Every platform is now full of financial content that either implicitly or explicitly invites comparison. Someone's portfolio update, someone's home purchase, someone's early retirement announcement. None of that content is necessarily dishonest, but consuming it regularly tends to nudge decisions in a direction that has nothing to do with your actual financial plan and everything to do with an emotional reaction to somebody else's highlight reel. People who quietly build wealth over long periods tend to be unusually disciplined about limiting this specific kind of input, not because they're uninterested in other people's success, but because they've noticed accurately how much it distorts their own judgment when they let it in too often. Habit 6. They treat windfalls as data points, not events. A bonus arrives, a tax refund shows up, an inheritance comes through, however modest. For a lot of people, these moments get mentally filed as separate from real money, money that arrived outside the normal system, and therefore money that doesn't need to follow the normal rules. People who quietly build wealth tend to do something specific and slightly less exciting with these moments. They run the windfall through the exact same decision-making process they'd use for any other dollar. Not automatically saving all of it necessarily, but genuinely evaluating it the same way rather than mentally categorizing it as bonus money that operates under different, looser rules than a regular paycheck would. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because windfalls, cumulatively, over a working lifetime, often represent a genuinely significant portion of someone's total earning potential. Bonuses, refunds, occasional gifts, inheritance. Treating that category of money as fundamentally different from earned income is one of the more common, quietly expensive patterns that separates people who build wealth from people with similar total lifetime earnings who don't. Habit 7. They're willing to feel behind for a long time. This is the one my uncle specifically warned me about, and it's the habit I think people resist the most. Honestly, myself included at various points. Wealth building, especially in the earlier years, genuinely feels slow. It feels, for a long stretch, like it isn't working, because the visible progress lags significantly behind the actual underlying progress. This connects back to something we talked about in a previous video, that crossover point where growth finally starts outpacing contributions, but the years before that crossover can feel discouraging in a very real, not imagined way. People who build significant wealth over decades tend to have made peace, specifically with feeling behind for a long time, without that feeling translating into behavior change. Without quitting, without chasing something faster, without deciding the slow approach clearly isn't working just because it doesn't feel like it's working yet. This is genuinely the hardest habit on this list, because it's not really a habit in the traditional sense. It's closer to a form of patience that has to be actively practiced, specifically because the emotional experience of the process and the actual mathematical trajectory of the process are frequently telling two different stories at the same time. My uncle passed away 2 years ago, and going through his finances afterward, as difficult as that process was, taught me more about these 7 habits than any article or research paper ever could. Nothing about his financial life was dramatic. Nothing about it would have made an interesting headline while he was building it. It was 7 boring, quiet, consistently repeated decisions made over about 4 decades that added up to something genuinely substantial by the end. I don't think any of these 7 habits are complicated. I think they're just unglamorous, which is exactly why they don't get talked about as often as they should, even though they matter more than most of what does get discussed. Tell me in the comments, which of these 7 habits do you already do without realizing it? And which one do you think would be hardest for you to actually practice? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious which of these lands differently for different people, because I suspect the hardest one varies a lot, person to person. If this series has helped you see your own financial picture a little more clearly, subscribe if you want to keep building this understanding with me, one honest, quiet video at a time. Until next time, take care of your money and take care of the quiet, unglamorous habits that actually build it. Nobody's going to clap for them. That's kind of the point.